Thanks for the introduction, and thanks everybody for being here. I'm really glad that there are so many of you. I was actually afraid seeing the panel that is going on. I was like, well, there's going to be nobody here. But I was wrong, so that's good. So welcome everybody. I'm going to talk about how to build software a little bit better, and I mostly want to focus on APIs. That's a space I've worked in a lot, and I want to talk a little bit about what you can do, what some good practices are. And if you're interested in the slides, you can find them here. I always use web-based slides, so a lot of the stuff that I will be showing you actually is linked from the slides. If you follow that link, you will see the same slides that I see, so they work in your browser, they even work on your phone, kind of, and that helps you to explore things a little bit, and I will also show you that link at the end of the talk. Okay, just very briefly about myself. So my name is Erik Wilde. I work as a principal consultant for INNQ, and I also work as, or not work, I do work with, let's put it like this, with the OpenAPI initiative as an OAI ambassador. So my role and goal in that regard is to make OpenAPI a little bit more widely known, to inform people about what it can do for them. And that's actually a little bit of the theme of this presentation, where I want to talk a little bit about why describing APIs is a good thing, what it can help with as an organization, but also what it can actually do for you as a developer. And I think there's still a lot of potential in using APIs a little bit more strategically. A lot of organizations, in my mind, still don't fully realize the potential of all the software that they're building by exposing it in a more reusable and more understandable way. And that's mostly what I want to talk about a little bit today. So I want to talk a little bit about how to build APIs better. And this is the ad section. So if you're interested in APIs, I run a YouTube channel that's called Getting APIs to Work. I frequently create videos. Mostly I talk to people in the API space about technologies, tools, things they've done, new things that are coming up. So if you're interested in APIs, check it out. It's called Getting APIs to Work. And hopefully if you search for that, you find it easily. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about API products at first. So what is it that turns an API actually into a product? Why does it make sense maybe to think about your APIs as products and not only or not primarily as a technical thing? Then I want to talk a little bit about API descriptions and OpenAPI. Like I said, that's one of the areas where I spend a lot of time and energy with, trying to explain and trying to find out practices and help people with that, how you can use your APIs in the best possible way when you describe them, so that you can share those descriptions with others, you can use tools that work with those descriptions, and so forth. And two of the things that I like saying when it comes to APIs is that you get the most out of your software capabilities, your software components, if you build the right API. So you have to think about, why am I even doing it? Who am I doing it for? What works best for them, right? So that's a lot of product thinking that goes into this. And then also building it right. So then starting to think of, okay, now that I know what I want to build, what are good ways for me to actually start building that and use tooling, for example, that helps me to build it in a better way, and use tooling also that helps others to consume it. So this is a little bit of the outline that we want to go through. I've been working in the API space for quite a while. I started with in a company that was trying to API enable their software. I spent quite a bit of time with vendors in the API space, whose main product were API gateways, traditional kind of the enterprise level vendors that probably most of you know. And one of the things that we've seen over the last couple of years is, when I started entering the space, you still had to explain a lot to people what an API is and why it may be a good idea to use APIs and so forth. This is not the case so much anymore. So I think for most people, that's really something where you can say, yeah, I understand what an API is, and I use them all the time, so what's the big deal? But what we see much more happening now, I think, is this thing where people start to understand that we're probably not going to stop doing this anytime soon. So we should really think about how we scale the practices around APIs, how we make sure that since we do build more and more things, that exposing them in a way that is reusable, understandable for others, is a good idea, and APIs are a good foundation for that. And in my mind, the big shift there is that this kind of forces us from this idea of building systems, where we just build one thing, to actually cultivating ecosystems, right? Really thinking about, I'm not just here building one thing, trying to figure out how I should build it in the best possible way, but I should really build a landscape of individual bits and pieces that can all evolve independently and are hopefully reasonably robust when I start using all these things in conjunction. And it's kind of interesting when you think of where this started, right? I'm guessing most of you have heard about the Bezos mandate. Who here has heard about the Bezos mandate? Yeah, well, not all of you, I'm surprised. So, the Bezos mandate happened actually more than 20 years ago. That's the most surprising thing, so to speak, where at least as legend has it, Jeff Bezos issued this mandate where he said, from now on, everything that is getting built within Amazon must have an API. He didn't say API at that point because the term wasn't established in the way that it is today, but basically that's what he said, right? It has to be exposed as something that can be reused by somebody else in an easy way. It needs to have a well-defined interface. And that's 20 years ago. In my mind, that's actually why we have AWS today, right? That basically paved the path to Amazon making the move from just selling stuff on the web to selling compute services. And as you can see, right, if you want to be agile as a company, it can be really valuable if you think about how do I build my bits and pieces so that I can rearrange them as needed and maybe sell some of them when I suddenly realize, oh, there's demand for that. Maybe we should make that actually public. So that's really, I think, the general space that you can see when you look at APIs nowadays, that since we're building so much software and so many digital capabilities, I think the main problem nowadays is not so much how do we build an API, but how do we scale the practice in a reasonable way. And you can also see that, I really like that picture, and this is, I'll just show you this one time to prove you that these actually are interactive slides. So you can click on that, and then there's an interactive version of that API landscape. I won't show you the details because it's too big, but I really like this. So this is done by API Days, and what they do is they try to collect all the players in the API space. So companies that are exposing APIs that I can use, that are creating tools that I can use if I am implementing APIs. So any player that kind of works in that API space. And it's very pretty. I like it a lot because you see so many logos. If you're a fan of logos and graphics, it's a good thing to check out. But I think it also shows you how big that space by now is. That it really is something where if we look at this ecosystem level, not so much as this, I want to build something, but like, how do I fit into this, right? How do I make the most out of this with me adding another bit into there or me taking advantage of certain bits and pieces? Then I think we really see the power of treating APIs as something that can help us to just build software in a better way. And I think there really is this idea where scaling the practice is something that nowadays is something that a lot of people think about, because since we're building more and more things, we also see that there are more and more opportunities to scale things and to benefit from economies of scale. Right? So if you build 2 APIs and you build them in an ineffective way, maybe that's not so bad. If you build 20 or 200, then suddenly you pay that cost of ineffective building 20 or 200 times, and maybe you reconsidering whether maybe you shouldn't make that a little bit better. Another thing that we see is also that organizations are more and more thinking about how do we create APIs in a more consistent way so that the APIs that we create have a at least slightly coherent look and feel. so that somebody working with our APIs doesn't get a completely different design every time they look at one individual APIs. It also is this economies of scale thing where removing busy work just pays off more if you make your developers more effective. And I'll get to this whole idea of automation and platforms a little bit later, where in my mind also this big movement of platform engineering that we see nowadays is also a testament of the fact that people are really interested in scaling practices around developing software better, and APIs play a big part of that. And when I talk about products, one of the things I really want to make sure is that a product is not necessarily something that is always intended for external consumption. This is a product in my terminology, right? This is just one of these car platforms. In that case, I'm German, so I have to show a German platform. Doesn't matter, right? But if you look at the car, the automotive space, right, the way how this industry was changed when they came up with this idea of building platforms is absolutely amazing. Right now, they can build so many more cars so much more effectively because they built these platforms, and then on top of these platforms, they build a whole bunch of different car models that are sold to the consumer. But that only works because they have really taken this product mindset also to their internal bits and pieces, right? And said, let's build a platform that a lot of different teams can then build on to build cars for different consumer segments. And instead of having to build 10 complete cars, we actually build one platform and then 10 kind of little bits and pieces that make the car look very different. And that's the mindset in my mind that really is something that is not existing fully in a lot of large organizations. There's still a lot of silos, people thinking about, oh, it's just, I want to get this done very quickly. And I think in the automotive space, right, this actually happened quite a while ago, and I don't think apart from, of course, like the boutique manufacturers, right? When you look at Ferrari or Lamborghini or like those ones, they don't have platforms because they don't have the economies of scale. But any other car manufacturer builds cars that way, and for a good reason, because otherwise you just couldn't compete, right? You would not be able to build cars at the cost and the quality and the scale that people expect them to be built. And if you think about what that means, I think for us in the digital space, we can think about our building blocks, our platforms, bits and pieces that we want to assemble are digital building blocks. And in my mind, a digital building block is best represented by an API. Right? That's the way how I use the digital building block. It's basically the shape that I can use. I don't have to care so much about how it's implemented. That's fine. As long as it works, I'm fine. I can use it. And that's the power and the scale that we can actually get to with APIs. And when you look at what APIs can do for us there, it's really that they can give us this language that different stakeholders can talk about. Where on the one hand, you can say, okay, it can be, that's basically the Bezos. Does this thing work? It doesn't. Huh, weird. It does? Yeah, but usually it would have this little highlight thingy around there. I don't know, that disappeared. Okay, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So, so the team-to-team communications, that's basically what Bezos was talking about, right? That's the idea of if one team produces a platform, a building block, another team should be able to consume that without ever talking to that team, basically. They have to expose an API, and if I want to use their capability in what I'm building, I can just use their API and I'm done. So that's a really good way how those two teams can collaborate without having to spend a lot of time in meetings or align or these kind of things. Another thing is that there's a whole bunch of scenarios where the APIs are between organizations, not within one organization, but between organizations, where if I have to offer something and I want to make it available to you, then I create an API. and I publish an API description, and I make it easy for you to understand and use it, and then you can just do that, right? So if you, one of the big examples, if you are building a web app and you want to use a payment service, ideally you can use a payment service that has an API. You don't want to implement a payment service, you just want to use it. So that's another thing where if they give you a description you can work with, all is good. Right, so you can easily use it and they don't have to spend time explaining it to you. So you can kind of enter business with another organization without ever having to talk to them. You just sign up, and if it works, everybody's happy. And another thing that I think is also important is to provide a little bit of what I call API literacy. So saying that if you're a product owner of anything basically in organizations nowadays, you should think about how can we make this available in a digital way, if it's not, right? Or how can we make sure that we get the most out of the investment that we've done when we developed a capability. So I really think these descriptions nowadays are very important, and we need to think more about how we can describe those products that we have in the most effective way. And doing that kind of goes this way when you look at the steps involved. So first, if I'm building a product, so step number one would be that I actually look at who am I building this for? So let's stick with this example of a payment service, right? So you would think about how can I make payment easy for somebody who wants to use a payment service. So what you would do is you would think about what do people typically want to do. You probably would talk to some people who are using payment services or who are planning on using payment services and start designing an API. Then you would want to start designing that API in a way that you describe it and you say what it does so that you can explain that to somebody who wants to use it. So you use some kind of description language, and there are a variety of languages available. So I'm pretty sure most of you have seen the three ones that I've shown here, something like OpenAPI, GraphQL, Async API. They're almost not even competing languages at this point. They just serve as description languages for different styles of APIs. So OpenAPI mostly for RESTful APIs, GraphQL for query-style APIs, and Async API for event-based APIs. So depending on how you think that your product should expose its API, you might decide that we should probably have, let's say, a RESTful API, and then you would probably pick OpenAPI. Then you start implementing that. So you actually start writing code where you would say, this is how our payment service works. Right? And then a consumer can start reading your OpenAPI description, understand it, do something with it, import it in their tooling, generate code, whatever it is they want to do. But since you have this shared understanding of what the API does, and the shared understanding is based on the fact that both of you understand OpenAPI, and there is a description of the API that you are exposing. And that just makes things much more seamless. And the more effort you put into doing this well, the easier it will be for others to use what you're exposing. Right? And in that case that we discussed for the payment service, it's something that is directly, hopefully, getting you more customers who sign up for your service and then pay. So that's good. Or if it's internal, you improve the capabilities that are reusable internally, and you give other teams the chance to use the things that you build and build their own things on top of it without having to spend time with meetings and so forth. And in order to do that well, you have to think through how you version those different things. So my recommendation usually would be to say, well, make sure you use the right description language, make sure you version your API well, you design it in a way that you can evolve it. Right? So a lot of presentations, I'm not doing that today, but talking about API design, how do you design an API so that after you've released it, you can still evolve it without breaking existing consumers. That's an important part of product design, right? How do I design a product that I can improve without making it hard for others to live with my improvements? And then thinking about how do I improve both the API itself, maybe the description, and then use that basically as my foundation, how I talk about APIs to all the people who hopefully want to consume my API. And very briefly, I just want to talk a little bit about how OpenAPI fits into all of it. I'm pretty sure that most of you, so who here has worked with OpenAPI in the sense that they have not just seen it, but they have, let's say, edited just a little bit? Okay, most have, very good. So I don't need to spend a lot of time with that. So OpenAPI is what used to be Swagger. Please do not say Swagger anymore. That's the main thing that I should always say. So the term Swagger kind of nowadays just refers to products that are still created or marketed by SmartBear. But the language itself, actually starting, as you can see, in 2016 or 17, depending on how you count it, but the language itself was renamed when it was donated by SmartBear to the OpenAPI initiative. Right? So for 7 years now, it has been called OpenAPI. And that's the right name to use. And what it does, in hopefully even less than 60 seconds, because most of you know what it does. It basically allows you to describe your APIs in terms of possible interactions. So you basically give a list of paths, right? So these paths are like the pages that you would have on a web page, website intended for humans. So these are the resources you could work with. It also tells you some of the things that some of these resources actually need as input when you interact with them, the same thing as you have on the web in forms, right? So if you fill out a form, that's data that is getting sent to the server. And then it also gives you the idea of representations, meaning that these are the kinds, this is the kind of data that sometimes you send, but most of the time you get back. So this would be the pages that after you submit something, right? So you say, I want to order a certain article, and then you get another document back that says, oh, here you go. Order accepted, it will be at your house in 2 days, right? So these are the kind of interactions that OpenAPI allows you to describe. This is what it looks like. Most of you said you've seen that, and we really don't need to go into this in any detail. But the reason why I just want to spend a little bit of time with OpenAPI is really saying that sometimes it's a little bit hard for people to see the many different ways in which OpenAPI can generate value. And one exercise I like to do, and that works much better, I think, in the States than it does here, because in the States, all the radio stations are FM. And so what you need to play for people so that they are happy is WIIFM, meaning what's in it for me. So explain to people why OpenAPI can generate value. And what I find interesting is just that there are many different kind of personas that can benefit from using OpenAPI, and therefore you also can get a lot of value out of it if you really manage it carefully throughout the whole life cycle, and everybody who's involved in those digital building blocks knows how to use it. So you could say, as a business or organization leader, what you want is you want to make sure that all the capabilities that you have, where you have spent money and resources to create them, that all of these are well described and are easily usable so that you can rearrange them as needed, right? So this is basically the Bezos thing, right? More or less. OpenAPI is also good that as an API developer, you want to describe the thing that you're going to implement, such as the payment service, so that for you as a developer, you have an easy way to implement that payment service, and you can use tools that will help you to do that better, because there is a lot of tooling out there because it's a very popular language. So that means that if you are using this kind of tool, or this kind of language, you get more tools that will help you to deal with it. As a consumer, it also helps you to have OpenAPI, because now when I look at an API, I understand what it is doing. I probably understand the structure of the documentation. I'm sure we've all seen those documentation pages that get generated from OpenAPI, where we have like this classic 3-column layout. And it's just something after you've seen 5, 10, 20 of those, it kind of comes natural to you that you can just kind of absorb it. Like you can think of that like the way you look at, depending on where you live, where you look at a food label, right? When you look at a food label, it's very easy for you to kind of read the things that interest you, like how much fat is there or how much sugar, whatever you're interested in, because you kind of know how these things work. You've seen many of them, so you can just scan it and easily get an understanding of the things you want to know. And increasingly, we also have, and this is kind of the latest addition to the stories of where OpenAPI can help, we have platform people, right? People who are in charge of building platforms or establishing standards for components that are being built internally. And their job then is to make sure that hopefully people follow certain best practices, or let's say good practices. Actually, I always try to not say best practices, so let's say good practices. And OpenAPI can help with that as well, where you can say, well, if you describe your API design in a certain way, we can help you with tooling that will give you some feedback whether this design looks roughly as we want it to be, or whether there are some things in there where we should probably talk about it, right? So this is also, again, this capability to establish this shared language of you show me your design and I can check it against certain rules. Not all of these rules that I may have for my design are necessarily something that I can fully automate, but a good bunch of them, and that's already very helpful. And then I can reduce the time that I need to spend to the interesting conversations and not making sure that you properly capitalize the things in your API design, right? Which is also something that probably helps if you do that consistently, but it's something you can easily check in an automated way. And what we see there is that OpenAPI can really help, or let's say API descriptions, okay? API descriptions can really help a lot throughout the whole API lifecycle. This particular lifecycle I've stolen from WSO2. A lot of companies in the API space have lifecycles. There's no particular reason I picked this one other than I found it pretty beautiful, the way it was designed. And by the way, by now I think, actually I have to fix that, I think. Now you could really take that OpenAPI logo and put it everywhere, right? For each of those stages throughout the API lifecycle, so here this create, secure, document, test, version, publish, promote, monetize, and retire. For all of these stages throughout the API lifecycle, there is tooling that will actually work with OpenAPI to help you, right? So you can do all these things manually, or you can use tools that use that shared language and that make it easy. Okay, yeah, we're back. And will make it easier for you to get support throughout these stages of the life cycle. And here, another little ad break. For those of you interested in not just talking about APIs, but talking about workflows. Just 2 weeks ago, we announced a new specification from OAI, which is called Arazzo. Now, I promise I will say it like this, Arazzo, because it's an Italian word. It's the Italian word for tapestry, so like a large thing you put on the wall that is very intricately woven. The idea of Arazzo is that it supports API workflows. So it allows you to say, in order for this business case to be implemented, you need to call this API with those parameters, take this output, and then call this API, and so forth. This is very easy to understand for pretty much everybody, I would say, because anybody working with APIs knows that very rarely you get anything meaningful done with one API call, right? It's always a combination either within one API or across a variety of APIs. And so far, there really hasn't been very good support for that. The goal of this language is to try to change that. We'll see how that is going. If you're interested in that, check it out. I will not talk any more about that language. But the idea is the very same, where we say, if we can describe workflows in a machine-understandable way, then we can see tools being built around it. We can generate documentation from it. We can test APIs against it. We can generate SDKs that specifically support a certain business process, right? So we'll see how that goes. So far, again, the specifications is basically now like 2 weeks old. so not that much tooling exists. But it's very easy to explain to anybody what the value could be. And we'll see a year from now, let's say we'll see whether we see any uptake or not. But I am optimistic that this will actually become useful. And we'll see what the tooling is doing. OK. What I want to spend just a little bit of time with, because mostly I think I want to talk about API management more, about kind of the tools and the technologies you can use. But I also want to make sure that I talk a little bit about actually building the right thing. And that's something that I find really interesting to think about. What are actually the different APIs that I have, right? And in many organizations, if you go to large organizations, a lot of the APIs that you see are built more in a way that I would say inside out. So somebody said, oh, I have a thing here that does something. Let's create an API, right? And then that becomes a very technical thing where System X exposes an API that allows you to do whatever System X is doing. And that may or may not be very meaningful at the business level. On the other hand, it may make more sense, and some organizations are trying hard now to try to do that, to build APIs more from an outside-in perspective and think about what are valuable things that people might want to consume, where we could create an API so that either internally or externally, we allow them to consume it, right? And then you end up, hopefully, with an API landscape that is more aligned with business value and not so much with the implementation landscape. And in order to give you a little bit of inspiration, and I won't have time to go into any of the details here, I want to show you this idea of how you can monetize APIs. So one of the things that I think a lot of people sometimes think is that, oh, I can make money with APIs because there are some companies making a lot of money with APIs. I don't even know what the current valuation is of Stripe, but it's always very high. I don't know, many billions. And so people are kind of come to the conclusion that, yeah, oh, I want to do that, right? Like they expose an API, so I'll just do the same. But it doesn't really work like that, right? So Stripe isn't worth billions of dollars because they have an API. It's because they had a pretty good business idea, which happens to involve an API, right? But that's the main thing here. So there are different ways of how you can think of how APIs can create value for your organization. And like I said, I won't have time to go through all of this, but I just want to inspire you. Quite a while ago, there was a report that was created, and I hope it's still working because it's, yes, it shifts around by, who here knows programmable web? Mike, I know. It's sad. Yes, it doesn't exist anymore, but it was one of the really early places where you could go for good API information. They basically were the ones who really initiated that first wave of API enthusiasm. Then it kind of went out of business. Then Salesforce bought it, or MuleSoft, whatever. And then they basically just retired the whole thing. But quite a while ago, what they did is they created this idea of what are different ways how APIs can create business value. It's a 60-page report, but it's really nice because it shows you all the different ways, and I'll show you 2 examples, which are actually readable, how APIs can actually become valuable building blocks for your organization. And I think it's a really inspirational thing to look at that and think about, I never thought about how this could actually work. And if you have some time, like I said, it's 60 pages, but you can still find it if you know where it is. So it's living somewhere on mulesoft.com now. And here are just 2 very brief examples. So one example is a partner business model. So this is just a zoomed-in part of the overall big taxonomy that they have created for all the different business models. So this one is an interesting thing. So this is Walgreens. It's a US chain of drugstores. And they have photo printing machines. And they thought about we have these photo printing machines standing around, not printing photos most of the time. What can we do? And then they created an API that allows people to build an app which then submits images to the printer so that people can then get the pictures from the Walgreens drugstore, right? So what they did is basically they said, if anybody has a good idea how to build apps that needs pictures to be printed, we're open for business, right? You can do that. And then there's a revenue share between people sending or the apps sending people who are printing the pictures and Walgreens for printing the pictures, plus Walgreens gets more foot traffic into the stores, which is good too. Right, so again, somebody was smart enough to think about, we have this valuable resource, which are the photo printers, and then thought, how can we digitally enable those, right? Because before that, you could just go to the store and enter your memory card and print pictures there. And now they have an API, and people can write apps, right? So that's a cool idea, I think. And the other one is a very different business model, one that we all know, is this idea of just creating APIs for audience. And the good example there is, it's actually not that anymore. But if you go there, at least recently when I tried it, it's the exact same thing, just different logo. Right, so, and Twitter or X is not the only one doing it, where they said, we don't really make any money by building authentication services, but it drives traffic, right? It encourages people to sign up, because then life gets easier for them, because they have the Google account or the X account or whatever. So let's do that, right? So in terms of money that they get out of it directly, zero. Well, it's negative, because they have to scale up their authentication service. But in terms of generating audience, seems to be a good choice. They've been doing that for a long time. Right? So again, this is more the outside-in view, where you start to think about what is actually creating value for us as a company. Well, in those cases, right, it's having a lot of users. How do we get users? We encourage them to sign up. How do we encourage them to sign up? Maybe through that. Right? So again, very much outside-in driven. And I think these examples are really interesting, because they show you that most value creation of APIs is not by charging for APIs, but by doing things that drive value for the organization, right? And a lot of that, most of that by far, is indirect, and that's fine. Somebody is just smart enough to do that, to figure out what drives value, and then figure out that maybe this additional digital building block would help us doing that. Okay. That was my brief attempt to tell you a little bit about how to build the right API by thinking outside in, thinking about what are the valuable building blocks we could build. And now I want to spend a little bit of time, I don't have much left, sadly, about building the API right. So how can you now do things in a scalable way? And one of the things we've seen, I love this picture. This was created by Mark O'Neill, a Gartner analyst. And his observation about the API space, that's where I spent most of my time, was that gateways, API gateways, followed this path of becoming these bigger and bigger components, and at some point they became so big and heavy that now we have this new crop of smaller and much more modern API gateways, which don't claim to do anything for you, but it's more the idea that we have now an ecosystem of, on the one hand, you have the technical API management in the gateway that secures your API, but we also now can add additional ingredients to it that do useful things for us. And in order to stick with my allotted time, I will skip those bits here. I'm sorry for that. But one of the things I find interesting is just that we've seen platform engineering really gaining momentum, I would say, starting last year. And right now, actually, there's Platform Conf going on, right? So now there are like whole conferences around platform engineering. And it's this whole idea of allowing people to do things faster by automating certain things, right? Building that golden path that people should be following and giving them tooling that makes them more effective. And since this is such a thing now, we also see more and more tools showing up, and those show up in the API landscape that I showed you that are very interesting, because we develop so many APIs that developing those tools also becomes more and more reasonable. Right? Because so many people are using APIs, exposing APIs, so you get more tools with really cool ideas. And I want to spend just a little bit of time to show you some of the tools in increasing order of obscurity and how popular they are, just to give you a feel for the kinds of things that are now happening in the API space and which maybe you're interested in using, maybe you have used, or you're interested in checking out. And what this really comes down to, and I just love this picture, so I have to show it, and always I have to come up with a story for this. This is actually my shoes. What is this? Any guesses? Not the shoes. A heater? Streetlights, yes, thank you very much. Traffic light. I just love this. It's basically for cell phone people, right? So let me just run this. It's like, oh, it's red, right? So somebody thought about what are people doing anyways, right? They're looking on their phones, and how can we make their life easier by like putting the streetlight there instead of there? Smart thinking. And the same is happening in the API space, right? Where people hopefully are using APIs anyway, so how can we make their life easier by building good tools? The first one that I want to talk about very briefly, who here has used Spectral or Vacuum or any other kind of linting tool? Some of you? Okay, not enough. So linting is really popular in the API space now. It's basically the idea of using a piece of software, going through your OpenAPI definition and saying, you shouldn't be doing that, right? We don't do this, like checking for example, naming conventions and then many other things. So it's this thing where if you build a large set of APIs and you want them to look and feel similar, then having these rules that you can check against makes your life much more effective than having to do that with manual reviews. Right? So really, this one really has become a very, very popular tool. So popular that it's not just Spectral, it's Vacuum is another tool that also was released not so long ago. So this becomes kind of an established thing that people are doing. Number two. Mocking. Anybody has used mocking here, API mocking? Some of you have, thank you. Oh, surprisingly, many more than linting. Maybe my order is wrong. I thought most people have done linting, but apparently not. So mocking is the idea that I can take an OpenAPI definition and I can basically stand up a mock server that implements the API. It doesn't do any business logic, but if I want to have somebody, for example, starting working on an UI, I can give them the mock server and they can start coding and see whether it does something that works for them, right? So it's a good idea to prototype, to get feedback from developers who are intended to use my APIs so that I can more easily set this up for them, and then we can have a conversation around, do you like this design? No, okay, let's tweak it, and then we can do it again, right? So, and there are a whole bunch of tools in that space now that do mocking. Number three, fuzzing. Anybody has used fuzzing? No? Okay, one. Okay, very good. But in that case, my order was right, so this is a more obscure tool. Fuzzing is the idea that you test your API by sending requests that are not totally wrong, but a little wrong, right? So you send a request, for example, where you send an integer that is not within the value range that it should be. And then the API should say, no, you cannot do this. But it may just crash, or it may just do something that you didn't know it was doing, right? So fuzzing, again, is a good tool to test your API. And if you have described your API in a good way with a schema that really has all the data types in it and all the limits and so forth, you can just use it, right? There's almost zero cost to start using this and improve your API if you just know about this tool and put it into your practices of how you develop APIs. And the last one is so obscure that there's no tooling around for it, so I cannot ask whether anybody has used tools. But I love this idea. So greasing is the idea that if you build your API to evolve over time, you have to deal with the fact that some implementations may just count on certain things that your API currently does, even though you never promised that you will do that. So one example, you return a list of results. That list is sorted, not because you said it will be sorted, just because that's what your implementation just does for some reason. Now you will have clients relying on that. And they look at 10 responses and say, oh, it's sorted, right? So they start implementing it and they don't sort it because they assume it's sorted. And now when you change your implementation and you return things unsorted, which is totally fine because you never promised to be sorted, now those implementations have a problem, right? And now you could say, okay, who's to blame? Technically them, but practically you have a problem, right? You have to solve that. So greasing would be the idea that you actually sometimes change the responses of your APIs in a way so that these bad implementations that rely on observable things that are not part of the contract, that those implementations get tripped up earlier. This is something, the concept of greasing, it's actually an acronym for something, I forgot what, comes from internet protocols, right? Where it's the same kind of thing. Protocols on the internet should be able to evolve actually over decades, and there are a lot of problems with implementations that just happen to do things in a certain way, which has worked for the last 10 years, and now something changes and suddenly there's a whole lot of stuff breaking, even though technically it shouldn't break. So I think this is another example just of where maybe we'll see tools, maybe not. But it's an interesting thing to think about, that if we have enough people running into these problems and we have enough practitioners who say, we should be better with this, right? Then maybe somebody ends up building a tool, and if you learn about that tool, you can start using it. Okay. And that's it. What I wanted to do is really, I just wanted to talk a little bit about, I think, that a strategy in the API space, that you really think about what are we using APIs for, how can we use them strategically, how can we help our developers, how can we make sure that we do things in the most effective way, that can help you to really do good things in the long run, right? So my advice would be, think of components that you're building as API products, right, that somebody should be able to use because you describe them properly. Make sure you build the right ones, right? So have conversations with customers or potential customers. Use practices and use tools that allow you to build these things in an effective way. And this API landscape really is growing every year. More tools are around, and you can just build things more easily and more effectively if you just look a little bit at how the space is progressing. And that kind of closes the loop to this whole idea of platform engineering, right? Where this whole idea is really to make sure that more and more of these practices should be baked into the practices and a platform. And I think, like I said, for the last year, this whole platform engineering space has really taken off a lot, and I don't think this is going to stop anytime soon because we're just building more and more digital stuff. And the more we can help with making that more effective, I think the better it is for all of us, for those who build things, for those who consume things, for those who consume the end product, and also for the organizations who hopefully make sure that they take advantage of all these economies of scale that we more and more see appearing. And with that, I am done. Thank you very much. Once again, if you want to look at the slides are available online. So I put in a lot of links. So if you want to follow those links, then you can just look at the slides and click on the things. It's just a web page. And that's it. Thank you very much.